Hello, everybody. It's good to see you here. I hope you are having a good day. And if you're in the UK, I hope you're enjoying the lovely weather. And wherever you are, I hope you're having a good day. Just while we're waiting on a couple of stragglers getting in, um, I'll update you on my adventures going to the rock nearby. Last week, I was telling you that I'd been up to see along the cliffs around where I live. There's this amazing rock formation, and on it live an enormous number of birds. It's really quite something, the seabirds there. And this week, I decided to buy a pair of binoculars, a much more powerful pair than I already had. And they arrived, and so I headed along. And although the cormorants weren't there this week, it was incredible. I was able to see much more clearly the, a couple of birds in particular. There's lots of seagulls and pigeons actually living there, interesting enough, on the cliffs. Rock doves is their actual name, which I guess makes sense. But the ones that really struck me was there was a bird called a guillemot, which is jet black on its back, with a white underbelly, with a very refined, kind of elegant feminine shape, with a very sharp looking beak. And also another bird, which looks very similar, is a razorbill. Has the same kind of jet black back, white forefront, but has a kind of curved beak, or I guess razor beak. And these birds I could see really close up in places I'd never seen them before. Many of them were crammed together, shuffling on the rock shelves above the waves. And they're not very good flyers. They struggle. They're much better at swimming or diving to catch fish. So they were often trying to land and having to swing back round again. So that was really fun. And I'm looking forward to taking. I've got a tripod for my binoculars, so hopefully next week I'll be able to set that up and have an even better time with it. So today we're going to be looking at the nature of evil, or kind of the character of evil, particularly as it's displayed in The Lord of the Rings. The reason why I wanted to do this topic was actually inspired by when I was on Apostolic Majesty's channel and we were talking about the Lord of the Rings characters. And if you haven't seen it, if you get a chance, have a watch. It was great fun to do, and I learned so much from talking with Apostolic Majesty. His knowledge of Tolkien is incredible. And one of the things that we speaking about on that stream was how Tolkien doesn't have caricatures, or at least he's not somebody who has a simplistic view of characters, particularly his evil characters. All of them start out good and fall. So there's this, he's building off this Christian idea that God is good and what he creates is good. And so if there's evil in the world, it must have fallen because God didn't create evil. And so Satan fell, classically, and humanity fell with Adam and Eve, and so on. And Tolkien's building on that in his mythology. But I wanted to go a bit more into detail about it because re-looking over some of the passages, it struck me that we can get a glimpse into what precisely it is that made these characters fall in the first place, and thus have a better understanding of what for Tolkien is the cause of great evil in the world, and I guess for Christian theology too. And beyond that, then, as well, also how we can guard ourselves from falling into evil. Um, because even though there may be explicit forms of evil or obvious forms of evil that we would never dream of falling into, well, all of these characters started out good. And that is in itself is a warning to us that we who may think of ourselves as good or not evil can easily slide into evil. So I'm interested to look at that too. A word of warning though, as I was reading through, Elrond has this quite interesting thing to say about it, this subject. He says, if I get to the right page, it is perilous to study too deeply the arts of the enemy, for good or for ill. So we have to be careful when we're doing this sort of subject, that we're not trapped in the arts of the enemy and thinking too deeply about them in some ways. It's better to have a cursory glance over than to study for end and end and end. So this is just going to be the focus of this stream, and hopefully it touches on those things, the ways people fall, but then also offer some kind of solutions or ways we can avoid falling ourselves in the ways that these characters do. Just a further note before we get into it, some of you may have seen that the title of the stream changed a little bit. So initially it was to do with Sauron's unconstrained vision, but I've changed it to Saruman's. There's a couple of reasons for this. Oh no, I should say first, both images that I used were drawn by John Howe. He's got amazing artwork to do with Middle Earth, so if you get a chance, check out his artwork. It's really incredible. He was involved in designing the Lord of the Rings film along with Alan Lee. So I changed from Sauron to Saruman for a couple of reasons. One of them is that what we know about Sauron's fall primarily comes from Tolkien's letters. It's not actually within the Lord of the Rings as a book itself, and it's very limited in the Silmarillion. There's a bit more on it, but there's not detail. It's more in his letters, and his letters are written sometime after he had written these books, or at least the ones that we'll be looking at. Why that's important is it's possible that many of these ideas that he later had are being read back into the text, or they're not original to the text. And so it seems somewhat wrong to kind of start from there. By contrast with Saruman, it's actually in The Lord of the Rings we see the reasons why he's fallen. He's a much more relatable version of Sauron, you might say, within this story. And so we'll use that as our basis for exploring the nature of evil, and use the letters which talk about Sauron and Saruman and other characters as a way of kind of expanding on those points. The other good thing with Saruman as a point of departure is we can compare him with Gandalf. Gandalf can act as a foil, being a very similar character but taking a different direction within the story, and we can see through their different approaches to evil and the ways they engage it more clearly what the nature of evil is and how to avoid it. So that's where we're going to go with. We're going to look at Saruman primarily and then move off into other things. So I think it'd be helpful just to outline a bit of context here for the story. So we're going to read through a passage where Gandalf meets Saruman. And both of these characters, along with Radagast the Brown and two other characters who aren't really in the Lord of the Rings, they are the Maya. They are Maya. The Maya are a kind of angelic being in Middle-earth. They are created. They're created by Eru Ilúvatar, the One, or the All-Father, who is the god of the Middle-earth universe, you might say. And under him are the Ainur. And there are higher Ainur, the Valar, and there are lesser Ainur, the Maya. And these angelic beings kind of govern on behalf of Eru, the world. Now, Sauron, he himself was also a Maya, and he had fallen. And during this time in Middle-earth, he was the dominant power. So the Valar decided to send 5 of the Maya to Middle-earth. And these Maya were to be restricted to the forms of men, of old men. And their job, this was because their job was to, rather than fight Sauron directly, was to guide and instruct the free peoples of Middle-earth and help them to lead their own resistance against Sauron. So these 5 included Saruman the White, who was the head of the Order of the Istari. That's the order that they were part of. Gandalf the Grey, Radagast the Brown, and the two blue wizards. So that's their job, that's who they are, and that's what they're about. Saruman, as the chief of the Order, is supposed to be leading this fight back, and that is why he has a great knowledge about the One Ring. He has studied it the most out of anybody, and he uses this knowledge. He's supposed to be using this knowledge to help fight Sauron. However, he had adjudicated that the One Ring had been lost, or at least that's what he told the White Council. The White Council is made up of Saruman, Gandalf, Elrond, Galadriel, and those leaders of kind of the Free Peoples, those elven kingdoms, and they were kind of directing the fight back against Sauron, at least in their own countries. So the passage we're about to read is given by Gandalf. It's a retelling of what happened. He's currently at the Council of Elrond, relaying his latest interaction with Saruman, who had called him to Isengard. And we're going to start midway through the conversation. We're going to keep coming back to this passage. So you have come, Gandalf, Saruman said to me gravely. But in his eyes there seemed to be a white light, as if a cold laughter was in his heart. Yes, I have come, I said. I have come for your aid, Saruman the White. And that title seemed to anger him. Have you indeed, Gandalf the Grey? He scoffed. For aid? It has seldom been heard of that Gandalf the Grey sought for aid. One so cunning and so wise, wandering about the lands and concerning himself in every business, whether it belongs to him or not. I looked at him and wondered. But if I am not deceived, said I, things are now moving which will require the union of all our strength. That may be so, he said, but the thought is late in coming to you. How long, I wonder, have you concealed from me, the head of the council, a matter of greatest import? What brings you now from your lurking place in the Shire? The 9 have come forth again, I answered. They have crossed the river. So Radagast said to me. Radagast the Brown, laughed Saruman, and he no longer concealed his scorn. Radagast the bird tamer, Radagast the simple, Radagast the fool. Yet he had just the wit to play the part that I set him. For you have come, and that was all the purpose of my message. And here you will stay, Gandalf the Grey, and rest from your journeys. For I am Saruman the Wise, Saruman Ringmaker, Saruman of many colours. I looked then, and saw that his robes, which had seemed white, were not so, but were woven of all colours, and if he moved they shimmered and changed hue so that the eye was bewildered. I liked white better, I said. White? He sneered. It serves as a beginning. White cloth may be dyed, the white page can be overwritten, and the white light can be broken. In which case it is no longer white, said I, and he that breaks a thing to find out what it is has left the path of wisdom. You need not speak to me as to one of the fools that you take for friends, said he. I have not brought you hither to be instructed by you, but to give you a choice. He drew himself up then and began to declaim, as if he were making a speech long rehearsed. The elder days are gone. The middle days are passing. The younger days are beginning. The time of the elves is over, but our time is at hand. The world of men, which we must rule. But we must have power, power to order all things as we will, for that good which only the wise can see. And listen, Gandalf, my old friend and helper, he said, coming near and speaking now in a softer voice. I said we, For we it must be, if you will join with me. A new power is rising. Against it, the old allies and policies will not avail us at all. There is no hope left in elves or dying Numenor. This then is one choice before you, before us. We may join with that power. It would be wise, Gandalf. There is hope that way. Its victory is at hand, and there will be rich reward for those that aided it. As the power grows, its proved friends will also grow, and the wise, such as you and I, may with patience come at last to direct its courses, to control it. We can bide our time, we can keep our thoughts in our hearts, deploring maybe evils done by the way, but approving the high and ultimate purpose. Knowledge, rule, order. All the things that we have so far striven in vain to accomplish, hindered rather than helped by our weak or idle friends. Need not be, there would not be, any real change in our designs, only in our means. Saruman, I said, I have heard speeches of this kind before, but only in the mouths of the emissaries sent from Mordor to deceive the ignorant. I cannot think that you brought me so far only to weary my ears. He looked at me sidelong and paused a while considering. Well, I see that this wise course does not commend itself to you, he said. Not yet. Not if some better way can be contrived. He came and laid his long hand on my arm. And why not, Gandalf? He whispered. Why not? The ruling ring. If we could command that, then the power would pass to us. That is in truth why I brought you here. For I have many eyes in my service, and I believe that you know where this precious thing now lies. Is it not so? Or why do the Nine ask for the Shire, and what is your business there? As he said this, a lust which he could not conceal shone suddenly in his eyes. Saruman, I said, standing away from him. Only one hand at a time can wield the one, and you know that well, so do not trouble to say we. But I would not give it. Nay, I would not give even news of it to you. Now that I learn your mind, you were head of the council, but you have unmasked yourself at last. Well, the choices are, it seems, to submit to Sauron or to yourself. I will take neither. Have you others to offer? So this key passage in the text, I think, relays a number of things about Saruman's fall, his fall into evil, and the nature of evil in Middle-earth, or at least the nature of evil as it tempts good people, people who think they are good. We can see at least three aspects to this passage of what Saruman's argument is to Gandalf. The first is, and we'll go into each of them in detail in due course, the first is, we must rule. Saruman thinks he and Gandalf should rule Middle-earth. They should displace Sauron as the rulers of Middle-earth. He believes that they must have power. They need power to succeed in defeating Sauron, but also in remaking the world. And that leads to the third aspect of this. Saruman believes he wants to order the universe. He wants to. Oh, did I cut out there? I think somebody's saying I cut out there. I'll move on to the first point. For Saruman, he wants to order Middle-earth. He wants to remake it and reshape it. He tells us that he believes that he and Gandalf have that knowledge to order all things as we will, which will be for the good, which only the wise can see. In a later passage, he talks about how he's willing to work with people for the common good. He thinks he understands what the good for all peoples are in Middle-earth. That will consist in knowledge, rule, and order. And so he wants to bring that into being. Now, this in itself is a good intention, right? He wants to reshape society, reshape Middle-earth, so that things are peaceable, harmonious, to the benefit of all people. Now, there is somebody else who also had a similar motive in the beginning, or at least Tolkien believes so. In letter 183, Tolkien writes the following: "In my story, Sauron represents as near an approach to wholly evil will as is possible. He has gone the way of all tyrants, beginning well, at least on the level that while desiring to order all things according to his own wisdom, he still at first considered the in brackets, economic well-being of other inhabitants of the earth. But he went further than human tyrants in pride and lust for domination, being in origin an immortal, angelic spirit." Sauron was a Maya who was under the auspices of the Valar Orla, and he was known for making crafts. He was a craftsman, and he liked making things. And you can see in this passage that what Tolkien's saying is Sauron, even in the beginning, he wants to remake the world. He wants to make it a better place. He wants to order it. It's interesting he uses that word, order all things, for the well-being of other inhabitants. But crucially, it's according to his own wisdom. Later, he talks about in letter 131 how Sauron and the elves cooperated in this regard. In the Second Age, after the destruction of Morgoth, which was Sauron's superior, Sauron remains in Middle-earth and in a beautiful form approaches the elves, wants to work with them. Tolkien writes, "He was still fair in that early time, and his motives and those of the elves seemed to go partly together. The healing of the desolate lands. Sauron found their weak point in suggesting that, helping one another, they could make Western Middle-earth as beautiful as Valinor." It was really a veiled attack on the gods, an incitement to try and make a separate, independent paradise. Gil-galad repulsed all such overtures, and also did Elrond. But at Eregion great work began, and the elves came nearest to falling to magic and machinery. With the aid of Sauron's law, they made the Rings of Power. Power is an ominous and sinister word in all these tales, except as applied to gods. So we can see here that for Tolkien, Sauron's initial drive is to remake Middle-earth, and he shares that with the elves. He wants to make it a better place. And the forging of the Rings of Power, 3 for the elves, 7 for the Dwarf Lords, 9 for men, this was part of that program. It was about rejuvenating, bringing life back to Middle-earth. However, Sauron forges his own ring to dominate them all, to control them all, but it's still at least in theory, to heal the world, to make it a better place, to restructure it according to his wisdom. Even Gandalf has this temptation lying within him. When Frodo offers him the ring, he says the following: "No," cried Gandalf, springing to his feet. "With that power, I should have power too great and terrible, and over me the ring would gain a power still greater and more deadly." His eyes flashed, and his face was lit as by a fire within. "Do not tempt me, for I do not wish to become like the Dark Lord himself. Yet the way of the ring to my heart is by pity, pity for weakness and the desire of strength to do good. Do not tempt me. I dare not take it, not even to keep it safe, unused. The wish to wield it would be too great for my strength. I shall have such need of it. Great perils lie before me. Tolkien writes in a further letter, letter 246, that this temptation was very real for Saruman and for Gandalf. But he's explicitly talking about Gandalf, but it would apply to Saruman too, because Gandalf and Saruman are the same kind of creature as Sauron. They're all angelic beings. And while Elrond and Galadriel are very powerful elves with their own rings, and may in their own minds be able to supplant the Dark Lord, Galadriel seems to believe so when she's tempted by the ring, they would need to amass an army to defeat Sauron. Only Gandalf and Saruman have the inner being, which is capable one-on-one to take on Sauron if they had the ring. And if they won, Sauron would be utterly destroyed, essentially. He would still exist, but he would never be able to get the ring back from such powerful beings. So Saruman and Gandalf have the power to become the next Sauron, literally to become the next Dark Lord. That's what Gandalf's referring to. He's scared of that happening. But Tolkien writes in this letter, Gandalf as Ring Lord would have been far worse than Sauron. He would have remained righteous, but self-righteous. He would have continued to rule and order things for good, and the benefit of his subjects according to his wisdom, which was and would have remained great. Tolkien's point here is that even if somebody has a vision of the good, of what's right for Middle-earth, it very quickly becomes tyrannical when it's imposed at without any thoughts of anything else in the world, particularly in the fact that it's according to our wisdom. We'll get more into this in further points, but at this point, it's worth just saying all of these figures, or at least Sauron and Saruman, absolutely hate anything which is different from their vision of what is good for Middle-earth. They absolutely hate it. They hate people who differ from what they want to see in the world. And we'll see more clearly in the third point what it is exactly they think's best for Middle-earth. And the real danger is when you think you're doing what is right, without any doubt, it can lead to terrible cost. That's the fear of somebody like Gandalf taking the ring, is he would believe he was doing the right thing, that he was doing a good thing. How can you ever challenge such a person? Coming across this idea, I was reminded of a number of quotes, or similar sounding quotes, that you may have heard similar variations of. Start with T.S. Eliot, 1936, in a poem included from The Rock. There's this line, O Lord, deliver me from the man of excellent intention and impure heart, for the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. In this passage, he's sounding almost biblical. He's implying that somebody who thinks they're doing good for you, well, they can often be deluded or misled. They may actually be doing evil to you. So, Lord, free me from that person. Journalist and philosopher Isabel Patterson in 1943, in The God of the Machine, wrote, most of the harm in the world is done by good people, and not by accident, lapse, or omission. It is the result of their deliberate actions, long persevered in, which they hold to be motivated by high ideals toward virtuous ends. Ayn Rand actually wrote a very similar thing in a diary, almost word for word. You can see in Reinhold Niebuhr, the Christian theologian, says something very similar. Most of the evil in this world does not come from evil people. It comes from people who consider themselves good. Finally, C.S. Lewis wrote, of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It may be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep, his cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. It's very powerful, and it's this idea that if you've got that absolute moral conviction of what you're doing is right, then the ends justify the means, no matter what the cost. And in these cases, with Saruman and Sauron, they believe that their vision of reality ought to be imposed on Middle-earth for its own good, in their view, or at least initially, regardless of what others think. And we'll get into why they have such a high view of their own moral vision. Just as a word of kind of adding to this, I was very struck by Tolkien's assertion that the ways to create such a world, or the aim to create this world in such a way, as being sacrilegious, in that it's an attempt to create paradise outside of heaven, or outside the realm of the gods. This kind of managed creation, this domineering approach to establish a utopia, tearing down all barriers in the process and remaking in that very planned and controlling way. It's not the place of Middle Earth to be like heaven in that regard. The utopian dream is blasphemous in that regard. And we can see a similarity with what Thomas Sowell has described as the unconstrained vision. Sowell outlines two primary visions, which lead us to disagree on so many fundamental issues because they're the basic assumptions we either share. On the one hand, there's the constrained vision. That's the idea that human nature is fallen, and so perfection on earth is never achievable. Hello, can anybody hear me? I think I'm back. Hello? Did Sauron get me? Did Saruman destroy me? Yay, I'm back. Thank you guys. Thank you for your patience. I don't know what's happening. Sometimes the internet is really bad in Berwick, so just hope for the best. And we'll keep going. We'll keep going. Hopefully it will last. So yeah, the unconstrained vision of yes, his arm is growing long. I love it. I love it. The unconstrained vision you've got this idea of these people who have this clear sense of what society ought to be, and as and human nature is fundamentally good, and what holds back this utopia is various institutions getting in the way. And so what needs to be done is you remake society without thought for the constraints that are needed. Rather, you actually just form it according to this blueprint. And those who push this forward are the self-professed anointed, those who have the solutions. And as long as they're in power and they're able to remake society, then your perfect society will exist. And that's precisely what Sauron and Saruman believe. They're trying to. Yeah, that's Tom and Sol I'm referring to. Sorry, I didn't know if I'd when I cut out. Yeah, so they're trying to remake society, believing that they are the anointed who can bring about the best for Middle Earth. And Gandalf is very tempted by this because he believes he wants to do good too. These people are sincere and they want to do what's right, and they're absolutely convinced that their cause is just and virtuous and righteous, and that is the dangerous thing, that they want to impose this and they may be wrong. Or in fact, it may be that they're imposing it at all, which leads us nicely onto the second part of Saruman's fall. Saruman, as we already seen, he wants to order all things and make them put rule into being, but he believes that he must have power, that him and Gandalf must have power. Indeed, they must have the ring of power to succeed. And that's why he calls Gandalf to him. He believes Gandalf knows where the ring is. And it's interesting how many times in the passage he mentions power and refers to Sauron as power with a capital P. He's almost obsessed with it. Now, in part, it's because he believes there is no other way to defeat Sauron. Let me repeat some of the lines. A new power is rising. Against it, old allies and policies will not avail us at all. There is no hope left in elves or dying Numenor. That is Gondor. This, then, is one choice before you. Before us, we may join with that power. It would be wise, Gandalf. There is hope that way. He explains his victory is at hand, and that he believes that by getting power, they will get more power and thus be able to control, and he doesn't explicitly say this, but usurp Sauron, and thus be able to rule in his place. And he says earlier, we must rule, but we must have power to order all things as we will. So he's convinced there is no other way to defeat Sauron apart from power. However, this sense of inevitability, that there's no other option, easily slides in to a lust for power. Gandalf recalls that actually when he first saw him, there was a strange look in his eye. A white light, as if cold laughter, was in his heart. And when Saruman says, "Where is the ring?" Gandalf says, as he said this, a lust which he could not conceal shone suddenly in his eyes. And this speaks to the multiplicity of emotions that are often going on. We're not pure beings. And even if we have what we think is a just cause, a righteous cause, we are beings with mixed emotions. And we often think, oh yes, I'm doing this for the right reason. But Tolkien's alert to the fact that often the self-interest plays a part too. That actually we may have our own wants are involved in this, and we're masking them perhaps with an idea that we're trying to get power. But in reality, we're just trying to. Well, we may sincerely want to make the world a better place, but also want power at the same time. I think that's partly Tolkien's point here. And we can see this in some passages, some further passages. So when Gandalf and members of the Fellowship have come from Helm's Deep with Theoden. They see Saruman locked in his tower, surrounded by the waters the Ents have unleashed on Isengard. And Gandalf is sad, actually, at leaving Saruman, because he says he tried to give him a chance. But Saruman, to quote Gandalf, he will not serve, only command. That very much sums up Saruman. He's not willing to. He could have served. He could have renounced Mordor and his private schemes, make amends by helping the peoples against Sauron. He could have given them advice. He knew a lot, and but he refuses. He wants power. He will stoop no lower. That's part of his desires, and indeed, he cannot even conceive of somebody not wanting power. Gandalf asks Saruman to surrender the key of Orthanc and his staff. And Saruman's, I'm going to quote the passage here, face grew livid, twisted with rage, and a red light was kindled in his eye. He laughed wildly. Later, he cried, and his voice rose to a scream. Later? Yes, when you also have the keys of Barad-dûr itself, I suppose, and the crowns of the 7 kings, and the rods of the 5 wizards, and have purchased yourself a pair of boots many sizes larger than those that you wear now. A modest plan. Hardly one in which my help is needed. I have other things to do. Do not be a fool. If you wish to treat with me while you have a chance, go away and come back when you are sober, and leave behind these cutthroats and small ragtag that dangle at your tail. Good day. So clearly, Saruman, even though Gandalf is asking Saruman to give these objects so that, I guess, as a pledge, but he's allowing him to be free. He says he could go wherever he would like, even if it was to Mordor itself. Saruman believes this is a power play by Gandalf to try and get more power. And indeed, he believes Gandalf wants to conquer the whole of Middle-earth, essentially, even though Gandalf's offering him a chance of redemption, or at least freedom. He can't conceive of anything else. And indeed, Sauron is the same. If we move to the... Give me a second, I'm just going to find the right page. It's great. I have a copy of Lord of the Rings, which is all books bound together, so I can just flick in between. So Eristor says that destroying... so this is the Council of Elrond. Eristor laments that destroying the ring is basically folly. It's folly because how are you going to get the ring to Mordor to destroy it? All the forces of Sauron in the way. It seems like a foolish task. And Gandalf says, despair or folly, said Gandalf. It is not despair, for despair is only for those who see the end beyond all doubt. We do not. It is wisdom to recognize necessity, when all other courses have been weighed, though as folly it may appear to those who cling to false hope. Well, let folly be our cloak, a veil before the eyes of the enemy. For he is very wise, and weighs all things to a nicety in the scales of his malice. But the only measure that he knows is desire for power. And so he judges all hearts. Into his heart the thought will not enter that any will refuse it, that having the ring we may seek to destroy it. If we seek this, we shall put him out of reckoning. And again, in a later passage, when he's first come back as Gandalf the White, Aragorn asks him what's the situation of play. Gandalf replies, the enemy, of course, has long known that the ring is abroad, that it is borne by a hobbit. He knows now the number of our company that set out from Rivendell, and the kind of each of us. But he does not yet perceive our purpose clearly. He supposes that we were all going to Minas Tirith, for that is what he would himself have done in our place. And according to his wisdom, it would not have been a heavy stroke against his power. And according to his wisdom, it would have been a heavy stroke against his power. Indeed, he is in great fear, not knowing what mighty one may suddenly appear, wielding the ring and assailing him with war, seeking to cast him down and take his place. That we should wish to cast him down and have no one take in his place is not a thought that occurs in his mind. That we should try to destroy the ring itself has not yet entered into his darkest dream, in which no doubt you will see our good fortune and our hope. For imagining war, he has let loose war, believing that he has no time to waste. For he that strikes the first blow, if he strikes it hard enough, may need to strike no more. So the forces that he has long been preparing, he is now setting in motion, sooner than he intended. Wise fool! For if he had used all his power to guard Mordor, so that none could enter, and bent all his guile to the hunting of the ring, then indeed hope would have faded. Neither ring nor bearer could have long have eluded him. But now his eyes gazes abroad rather than near at home. Mostly he looks towards Minas Tirith. Very soon now his strength will fall upon it like a storm. So both Saruman and Sauron cannot comprehend for the life of them anybody turning down the power of the ring. Or for that matter, power. The ring is power. And they assume that anybody who has the ring will be tempted, will fall for it and embrace its power. And indeed, Tolkien argues that this is actually quite right to an extent. Anybody who possesses the ring, in the end, will fall into its clutches and will take it as their own and command it. We see this in the very climax of the story, in that when Frodo is at Mount Doom, ready to cast the ring into the fire, at that point, when he has gone as far as he is mentally, spiritually, and physically able, he's unable to cast it away, and he claims it for himself. Tolkien, in one of his letters, I can't remember which one, I'm afraid, at this point, he speaks about how this is a reflection of the fact that all people, regardless of their strength or religiosity or whatnot, in the end need deliverance from temptation. He's summarizing the line in the Lord's Prayer was very influential to him. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And you can see this in the fact that a character like Gandalf absolutely refuses to take the ring. He will not take it, even for a second. He cannot take it because he knows even he, with his good intentions and his strong spiritual power and angelic nature, he will give into it eventually and he will use it. And so give into power. That's a very interesting point for Tolkien. There's no character, strictly speaking, apart from Tom Bombadil, of course, who will not be mastered by the ring. But then again, Tom Bombadil is not interested in making the world a better place beyond his borders. So maybe that's something to think about later in the stream. Be that as it may, Gandalf is very different from Saruman. And he tells us one of the characters asks him, what will you do with Saruman? After they've had their meeting with him. Pippin asks him this. And Gandalf says, nothing. I will do nothing to him. I do not wish for mastery. That's not his aim. And this can be seen as we get into the next section. This will be seen more clearly as to why Gandalf does not want mastery. And I see somebody put in a very apt point here. Samwise, as we will see, even Samwise has such temptations. So the third aspect of it, so we've gone through that Saruman and people like Gandalf as well wants to make the world a better place, but Saruman believes he has a right to make the world a better place, has a vision for it, a utopia. He believes that power is the only way to achieve this, and in part this is because he doesn't see a way of defeating Sauron otherwise, and he can't conceive of another way. Perhaps in part because he's been using the Seeing Stone and Sauron's been manipulating what he sees. But he doesn't have the moral imagination to conceive of another way of destroying the tyrannous power itself without replacing it. He can't do that. But the third aspect is that he is proud. He is extremely proud in a way that is very revealing. If we look at the passage again, Gandalf initially greets Saruman as Saruman the White. Now, the importance of this is his white robe signifies that he is the head of the Order of the Astari. And part of his being the head of the Order is he is there in Middle-earth, sent by the Valar to instruct and guide the peoples of Middle-earth. He is not to be leading the fight against Sauron. Rather, he's to be mobilizing the peoples of Middle-earth against him. That's his role. That's his vocation. That's what he's been given to do. But Saruman has changed himself. He believes he has more to bring than that, or at least he has the right to do more than that. He describes himself as, I am Saruman the Wise. He's always describing himself as wise and talking about how we should reorder the world according to the wisdom of the wise. He sees himself as that. He is the ring maker. He's made himself his own ring. And he is Saruman of many colours. His robes, which seemed white, were not so, but were woven of all colours. If he moved, they shimmered and changed hue. Saruman has written over his own robes, his white robes, and he's tried to make them into something new, something that reflects his higher status, his elevated status, or in his own mind, it's a way of exalting himself. He believes he has a right to do this, and this reflects his idea that he has a right to rule Middle-earth. He explicitly says, we must rule, we must have the power to order things as we will. But this was not his vocation. His vocation was merely to guide and instruct the rulers of Middle-earth to fight Sauron, not to rule himself, not to be the Lord of Middle-earth and set up his own kingdom. That was never his position. That was never his right to do that. This is an act of self-exaltation beyond what the Valar have appointed him to do. By contrast, and a very clear contrast, in Gandalf rejects mastery of Middle-earth. He's a powerful being. He could have it, but he rejects it. He follows his calling to guide the peoples, particularly the Fellowship. He's there guiding the Fellowship through its travails, even to the point of death. There's a passage in one of the letters by Tolkien, letter 330, where Gandalf, he talks about Gandalf's sacrifice. Let me get to the right part of it. Here we go. So he's an angelic figure, one of these old sages, and he's sent to guide the peoples of Middle-earth. Gandalf alone fully passes the tests on a moral plane anyway. He makes mistakes of judgment. For in his condition, it was for him a sacrifice to perish on the bridge of Khazad-dûm against the Balrog in defense of his companions, less, perhaps, than for a mortal man or a hobbit, since he had a far greater inner power than they, but also more, since it was a humbling and abnegation of himself in conformity to the rules. For all he could know at that moment, he was the only person who could direct the resistance to Sauron successfully, and all his mission was vain. He was handing over to authority, to the authority, capitalized, that ordained the rules, and giving up personal hope of success. That, I should say, is what the authority wished, as a set-off to Saruman. The wizards, as such, the Astari, had failed, or if you like, the crisis had become too grave and needed an enhancement of power. So Gandalf sacrificed himself, was accepted and enhanced and returned. So there's this idea in Tolkien that Gandalf, on the bridge, he could have thrown off the rules. He could have tried to take power himself. The ring was right there. He could have used the ring to fight the Balrog. Or he could have broken the rules of being restricted in this human body, revealed himself as this angelic power, and destroyed the Balrog quickly, and thus being able to direct the resistance. But no, he trusted in the authority, which is the One, the All-Father, the creator of Middle-earth, and his providence over things, which had been directing things throughout. And this is particularly enhanced when you think of what Gandalf says on the bridge. And sorry, I should have said that was the letter was 156, not 330. Gandalf says on the bridge, confronting the Balrog, "You cannot pass. I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Annor. You cannot pass. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun. Go back to the shadow. You cannot pass." Now, in the context of the story, it's never really explained what these words mean, but in the Ainundale, which is in the Silmarillion, we're told that Eru Iluvatar is the only one that has the power of the secret fire, which is the power to create life. And he uses that to create Middle-earth. So Gandalf is saying here explicitly, in the face of the Balrog, which is another angelic being who is fallen, who fell into the service of Morgoth, that he's willing to serve the authority Eru, and to follow the laws he has been set for coming to Middle-earth, even if it kills him. So there's no sense of self-exaltation, there's no overstepping his vocation. He's willing to carry it out to the bitter end. This is exactly a contrast to Saruman, who's not willing to follow his vocation, who believes he must step beyond it and take power himself in Middle-earth. And his reward Gandalf's reward is to be sent back as the new Saruman, or Saruman as he ought to be. Indeed, Saruman, we may even think, should have been there with the Fellowship. He should have been leading it. But instead, that fell to Gandalf, who became him, even greater than Saruman. This is all extremely relevant, because when we look at the nature of sin in Christian theology, I think Augustine put this point extremely well, that pride, he wrote in The City of God, is the beginning of sin. And what is pride but the craving for undue exaltation? And this is undue exaltation, when the soul abandons him to whom it ought to cleave as its end, and becomes a kind of end in itself. Indeed, Scottish minister Hugh Binning, I always have to get my Scottish Protestant research in there somehow, right? Hugh Binning, in the mid-16th century, expanded this idea. And Binning argued that pride is seeing an excellency in the self which is not there. It's a delusion. It's a way of seeing the self which is untrue. And it's more than that, though. It's pride attempts to make everybody see that excellency in ourselves, which is not there. It forces others to adore that thing, to adore us, when it's undue. And this leads ultimately to conflict in society for binning, because if you've got multiple people trying to get praise for themselves, get adoration for themselves, well, they're going to come into conflict because you can't adore everybody in this way. And so violence ensues. So pride is the source of sin, of lust for power, and thus of conflict for binning. And indeed, for Tolkien, it's the source of idolatry. He writes in letter 183, in The Lord of the Rings, the conflict is not basically about freedom, though that is naturally involved. It is about God and his sole right to divine honor. The Eldar, that's the elves, and the Númenóreans, the race of men, believed in the One, the true God, and held worship of any other person an abomination. Sauron desired to be a god king, and was held to be this by his servants. If he had been victorious, he would have demanded divine honor from all rational creatures and absolute temporal power over the whole world. So even if in desperation the West had bred or hired hordes of orcs and had cruelly ravaged the lands of other men as allies of Sauron, or merely to prevent them from aiding him, their cause would have remained indefeasibly just, as does the cause of those who oppose now the state god and marshal this or that as its high priest, even if it is true, as it unfortunately is, that many of their deeds are wrong, even if it were true, as it is not, that the inhabitants of the West, except for a minority of wealthy bosses, live in fear and squalor, while the worshippers of the state god live in peace and abundance, in a mutual esteem and trust. Tolkien's point here, essentially, is that pride leads to the desire that for others to worship you and take the honor that's due to God alone. And in Middle-earth, Sauron attempts to do this. He calls himself the King of Kings and Lord of the World. These are divine titles that no creature possesses, only Eru Ilúvatar. And it's a desire to force all creatures into worship of him. And ultimately, he believes that's to the benefit of all creatures, that they worship him. That through this a world which is all focused on him and ordered according to his will, when creatures worship him, they will achieve their purpose in life. Saruman has the same view. He wants others to worship him. And that's what the kind of world he wants to order. That's why he's exalting himself and creating new robes and a beautiful ring and changing his title to Saruman of many colors. And it's interesting, I think, that Tolkien mentions the state god here of the real world. You have to remember when Tolkien's writing this. Let me see if I can find the exact date. In the 1950s, when and this letter was in response to W.H. Auden's review of The Return of the King. He's talking about communism here, in particular, the idea that the state should dominate our lives, control everything in our lives, and deserves our unconditional support, adoration, loyalty, you name it. That's what Tolkien is responding to in particular. And he sees that as the equivalent of Sauron or Saruman, which is very, very interesting. So, and when pride is injured, when people are offended, vengeance is coming. It's because we see some excellency in ourselves and we care deeply about it, and people don't follow that when somebody hurts it, when somebody insults us, we fly into a rage and we're vengeful. And we see this with Saruman at the end of the book, in particular, in the scouring of the Shire. I read a fairly lengthy passage here, which gives you a sense of his absolute anger and scorn and just vengeful bitterness at having his pride insulted. A sudden light broke on Frodo. "Sharky!" he cried. Saruman laughed. "So you have heard the name, have you? All my people used to call me that in Isengard, I believe. A sign of affection, possibly. But evidently you did not expect to see me here." "I did not," said Frodo, "but I might have guessed. A little mischief in a mean way. Gandalf warned me that you were still capable of it." "Quite capable," said Saruman, "and more than a little. You made me laugh, you hobbit lordlings, riding along with all those great people, so secure and so pleased with your little selves. You thought you had done very well out of it all, and could now just amble back and have a nice quiet time in the country. Saruman's home could be all wrecked, and he could be turned out, but no one could touch yours. Oh no, Gandalf would look after your affairs." Saruman laughed again. "Not he. When his tools have done their task, he drops them. But you must go dangling after him, dawdling and talking, and riding round twice as far as you needed. Well, thought I, if they're such fools, I will get ahead of them and teach them a lesson. One ill turn deserves another. It would have been a sharper lesson if only you had given me a little more time and more men. Still, I have already done much that you will find it hard to mend or undo in your lives, and it would be pleasant to think of that and set it against my injuries." "Well, if that is what you find pleasure in," said Frodo, "I pity you. It will be a pleasure of memory only, I fear. Go at once, and never return." The hobbits of the villages had seen Saruman come out of one of the huts, and at once they came crowding up to the door of Bag End. When they heard Frodo's command, they murmured angrily, "Don't let him go! Kill him! He's a villain and a murderer! Kill him!" Saruman looked round at their hostile faces and smiled. "Kill him," he mocked. "Kill him, if you think there are enough of you, my brave hobbits." He drew himself up and stared at them darkly with his black eyes. "But do not think that when I lost all my goods, I lost all my power. Whoever strikes me shall be accursed, and if my blood stains the Shire, it shall wither and never again be healed." The hobbits recoiled, but Frodo said, "Do not believe him. He has lost all power, save his voice that can still daunt you and deceive you, if you let it. But I will not have him slain. It is useless to meet revenge with revenge. It will heal nothing. Go, Saruman, by the speediest way." "Worm! Worm!" Saruman called, and out of a nearby hut came Wormtongue, crawling almost like a dog. "To the road again, Worm," said Saruman. "These fine fellows and lordlings are turning us adrift again. Come along." Saruman turned to go, and Wormtongue shuffled after him. But even as Saruman passed close to Frodo, a knife flashed in his hand, and he stabbed swiftly. The blade turned on the hidden mail coat and snapped. A dozen hobbits, led by Sam, leaped forward with a cry and flung the villain to the ground. Sam drew his sword. "No, Sam," said Frodo. "Do not kill him, even now, for he has not hurt me. And in any case, I do not wish him to be slain in this evil mood. He was great once, of a noble kind that we should not dare to raise our hands against. He is fallen, and his cure is beyond us, but I would still spare him, in the hope that he may find it." Saruman rose to his feet and stared at Frodo. There was a strange look in his eye, of mingled wonder and respect and hatred. "You have grown, halfling," he said. "Yes, you have grown very much. You are wise and cruel. You have robbed my revenge of sweetness, Now I must go hence in bitterness, in debt to your mercy. I hate it, and you. Well, I go, and I will trouble you no more. But do not expect me to wish you health and long life. You will have neither. But that is not my doing. I merely foretell. So you can see here, Saruman wanted to scour the Shire. He wanted to face it and cause great misery there as an act of revenge because he believed the hobbits had essentially wronged him in destroying his home with the support of the Ents. Never mind the fact that he had attacked was chopping down the Fangorn forest and would have attempted to dominate all of Middle-earth. He believes he has a right to do that. So they've affronted him, the self-proclaimed god of Middle-earth, by stopping his plans, and he wants to cause them harm as a consequence. And even when Frodo spares his life, uh, though he very well deserves death for trying to kill him, he hates Frodo and his mercy because he believes it's an affront to his pride. It affronts his pride because he has an exalted view of himself where he should not have to have others' mercy. He shouldn't have to stoop so low. So we can see then that there are at least three key factors in Tolkien's presentation through the character of Saruman and Sauron and others to the nature of evil, or at least the nature of that evil which does most damage in the world. For there are other characters like Bill Ferny or maybe even Grima Wormtongue who their evil is more primal. They want maybe they desire something. Maybe it's lust, maybe it's wealth, maybe it's just for the delight of evil or so on. But these big characters, their evil comes from three things. The first is that they desire to implement a utopia that they have a vision of. They want to make Middle-earth into a paradise. Second, they believe they need to do this through power. Indeed, dominating power that rules all of Middle-earth. And third, they believe they need to be the ones to rule Middle-earth and establish this world because they are proud. They want to exalt themselves to the levels of God. And when they are frustrated in this, or if anybody gets in their way, hatred, anger, and vengeance come forth. But we should not be deluded to think that it is only the powerful that have this temptation. Indeed, I focused on Sauron, Gandalf, and Saruman, three angelic spirits, so very similar to Satan, and indeed they have the power to rule Middle-earth. But there are others, other powerful people like Galadriel and Elrond who have faced this temptation. They do not have the same level of power, but they are very powerful beings indeed, and with the backing of an army could do serious havoc. And if you've ever played the Shadow of War series, forget for a minute what it does to the lore of Middle-earth. Celebrimbor takes the power of the ring and wants to dominate and be a Dark Lord. He's an example of what Elrond or Galadriel might be like if they gave into that temptation. But then there's others. So Boromir, at the Council of Elrond, sees that although Saruman has fallen, there is wisdom in what he has to say, and that if he could use the power of the ring to help Gondor survive and to stave off Mordor, then it is justified. So he sees that as a good thing, although it's wrapped up for Boromir in the glory of it, that if he had the ring, he could call an army to himself and fight Sauron. So he doesn't aim to rule Middle-earth, but according to his vision or the stature of his life, he wants he wants the ring, he wants power, and he falls into evil eventually. To defend Gondor and exalt himself. But even he is a mighty man. He would be a great leader in the world today, and indeed he was one of the greatest men who lived in Middle-earth. But what about your ordinary Joe? Do they face this sort of thing? Well, there is a passage to do with Samwise Gamgee, who faces this temptation too. This takes place when, at the very beginning of Book 6 of The Return of the King, and in that, Frodo has been taken to Cirith Ungol by the orcs, and Sam is trying to get into the tower to save Frodo. And he is carrying the Ring of Power himself because he thought Frodo had died, and thought it best to take it. And he has stepped into Mordor. And Tolkien writes, as Sam stood there, even though the ring was not on him, but hanging by its chain about his neck, he felt himself enlarged, as if he were robed in a huge distorted shadow of himself. A vast and ominous threat halted upon the walls of Mordor. He felt that he had from now on only two choices: to forbear the ring, though it would torment him, or to claim it, and challenge the power that sat in its dark hold beyond the Valley of Shadows. Already the ring tempted him, gnawing at his will and reason. Wild fantasies arose in his mind, and he saw Samwise the Strong, hero of the age, striding with a flaming sword across the darkened land, and armies flocking to his call as he marched to overthrow Barad-dûr. And then all the clouds rolled away, and the white sun shone, and at his command the Vale of Gorgoroth became a garden of flowers and trees, and brought forth fruit. He had only to put on the ring and claim it for his own, and all this could be. So Sam also faces this temptation. He doesn't desire to rule Middle-earth. He doesn't want that responsibility. And he doesn't want to be a great warrior like Boromir. Nevertheless, he has a good vision. He wants to overthrow Sauron, and as a gardener, he loves growing things. He loves seeing life. He wants to bring life back to Mordor. And this is tied in with pride. He could see himself as the hero, as getting the glory. These things are wrapped up together. However, in the next paragraph, in that hour of trial, it was the love of his master that helped most to hold him firm. But also deep down in him lived, still unconquered, his plain hobbit sense. He knew in the core of his heart that he was not large enough to bear such a burden, even if such visions were not a mere cheat to betray him. The one small garden of a free gardener was all his need and due, not a garden swollen to a realm, his own hands to use, not the hands of others to command. We'll get to the kind of implications of that passage in a second, but Sam was able to resist, but he was nonetheless tempted to use the ring to create a utopia and exalt himself. And that should be a warning to all of us, that actually we all have that in our hearts. If we were given the opportunity of great power, we would be tempted to pursue the vision of the anointed. Indeed, you can see this perhaps with Plato's I don't know what you call it, allegory, or no, it's not an allegory. His story of Gyges' ring in the Republic, where there's this ring that can turn a person invisible, very much like the Ring of Power, I suppose. And when this is possessed, I think it's Gyges who has this ring. He's an upstanding citizen, but when he gets the ring, he starts doing wicked things. He starts stealing things, causing trouble, because he can get away with it, because the consequences are no longer there, because he's invisible. And Nietzsche made the point that even if a majority of people act in accordance with kind of civil norms of morality and are on a kind of fundamental level seen as good, or because they obey society's rules about how to act, in reality, most are cowards. They wouldn't act that way if they had power. They would be terrible people. They would let their desires run them, and their desire for power would be dominating. Only a few people are actually virtuous, and when put into that position, would be able to restrain themselves and refrain from trying to implement their utopia and exalt themselves. This is a warning to all sides of the political spectrum, I think, as well. Because although the unconstrained vision is identified with Thomas Sowell with the left, and certainly I think you can see with communism, Tolkien thought communism was a form of this sort of approach, but also kind of more contemporary things going on at the moment. There's certainly a strong emphasis on creating a utopia, remaking the world according to your own wisdom. There's also a problem on the right, and I definitely see it in many ways. There's a sense of if only we had power, if only we had the rulers, if only we had our elites in charge, or if only we were in charge, then things would be right, and we would remake the world and tear down how it is at the moment and build it up in a new way. That's precisely the vision of Saruman, and it tempts us all, including somebody like Sam. So this leads to the questions how to avoid evil, or pursuing good intentions with what we think are good intentions that are actually evil, and pursuing our own self-exaltation. Well, the first area that could have initially sprung to my mind from these readings is humility, or being meek or humble. Read Sam is able to resist the lure, not because he is particularly strong-willed or has a great moral fortitude, but because he recognizes that he's not large enough, he's not powerful enough, or capable of running, of maintaining such a utopia. He doesn't have that ability. Indeed, he doesn't even deep down want that. He's happy with his local garden. He's happy with his being able to tend his plot of land. He doesn't need the whole of Mordor, and he wouldn't be able to maintain the whole of Mordor. He accepts the limitations of his own biology, of his own culture, of his own stature, just the limitations placed on him by his own faculties and the world around him, I guess you could say. He accepts his place in the chain of being where hobbits ought to be. And that's not to say that he's submissive to all power. I think that's an important point. That could be construed as, well, you just roll over and let anybody dominate you. No, he's currently on a quest to destroy the ring and to defeat Sauron. He's not, because he recognizes he's not a slave to Sauron. That's not who he is. He's a hobbit, and he wants to live the best of his life as a hobbit. He doesn't need to be the Lord of Middle-earth. In his own way, Gandalf is also humble. As we spoke about earlier, when he faced the Balrog, it was an act of humiliation, of humility, I should say. Well, both. To allow himself to be put into mortal danger by the Balrog, when he could have thrown off his mortal body and broken the rules, but instead he knew his place, he knew what God had sent him to Middle-earth for, and so accepted his vocation as a guide, as a director, not as a leader and ruler of Middle-earth. It's that sense of knowing your own place, knowing your own abilities, not over-exaggerating your own intellectual power, your own sense of what is right, which are key. And I think those two are really important. Saruman believes he has a right to rule because he's wise. He's constantly calling himself Saruman the Wise. He has a conceited notion of how knowledgeable he is, and how he as a consequence, he's unaware that he's actually following an evil path. He's uncritical of himself because he is proud, and he thinks he knows what is best without needing to consult the input of others. At the same time, he's uncritical of his vision of what is good because of his conceited notion of his wisdom. He thinks he has the benefit of all peoples in mind and will pursue it regardless of what others say. So it's that need to be self-critical, self-examinatory, and not have an enlarged sense of oneself. Being content in one's place in the hierarchy of life, as it ought to be. And that's it, I think, a crucial point. It's not, as I was saying, it's not under the submission of Sauron, but it is embracing the gifts you've been given by Eru Ilúvatar, the All-Father. And that leads to the second point here. At least for Gandalf, he knows two things that neither Saruman nor Sauron can countenance, and he's able to resist the temptation of the ring through it. First, he knows that taking the ring and using the ring will lead to evil. It will make Gandalf a new Dark Lord. He explicitly says that. And so, no matter how much good he can cause through the ring, it's ultimately an evil thing to do, and it is wicked. He knows that. And so, even if it appears tempting that he could work it for good, Gandalf's able to resist because he knows where the path ultimately leads. But second, he also has the moral imagination to conceive of an alternative to the pursuit of power for defeating the Dark Lord, which is the destruction of the Ring of Power itself. He says, as we mentioned earlier, Sauron can't imagine that we would want to tear him down and not put anybody in his place. He thinks that we'll only try to replace him with somebody else who's wise and knows how to run the universe. Gandalf can imagine a world where we have no tyrant, where we defeat it and bring it down. And that in itself is a really fascinating idea. Can we even conceive of approaching contemporary politics with that vision in mind, of not wanting to put somebody else in the position of those who run the world at the moment? Can we even think of it in that way? Now, of course, Gandalf's not an anarchist, or at least he's not kind of the traditional, like, let's tear it all down, eat the rich sort of guy. He's quite happy for kings and feudal systems to exist. Indeed, The Return of the King is about Aragorn returning to Gondor and reclaiming the throne and establishing a new kingdom, a kingdom of life and fullness and richness, and to the glory of Eru Ilúvatar. Gandalf's not opposed to rulers. He's opposed to the domination of all life under the Dark Lord. Can we even think in those terms today about not trying to replace one set of elites with a new set of elites, but rather trying to create or remove those shackles so that there's these independent kingdoms living with their autonomy? Is that even a consideration? I find it difficult to conceive, to be honest. I don't know how it would work. I don't know how you destroy the ring in the real world. But certainly that sort of moral imagination that Gandalf has enables him to resist the temptation to use the Ring of Power, because he recognizes the problem isn't who's got the ring, it's that there is a ring of power. And the third aspect to this, which helps Gandalf resist the power of the ring, is, for want of a better word, his faith. His faith in Eru Ilúvatar. He's a servant of the Secret Fire. He knows that all things in Middle-earth are directed by God. And this concept goes back to the Ainundale, but it's also at various points there's hints thrown in by Tolkien when he says that Bilbo and Frodo were meant to find the ring, and this was directed by a power other than evil. What he's basically saying there is what's iterated in the Silmarillion, that all things, whether good or evil, all beings, their free actions are directed by God. This kind of relies on a Thomistic understanding of causation, where God is the primary cause of all things, but creatures can act freely without their agency being compromised, even though it's directed by God. You could say God's power is non-competitive with our own. And that's because God is nothing like us. We often think of God as an enlarged version of ourselves. Indeed, Sauron and Saruman think that way. Because they see themselves as with more power as being God. But God is not like creation. He is the creator. He's categorically distinct from anything in the world. You can't point to anything and say, that's God. And so God's able to act in a way that's completely different from us. Whenever we act, it's competitive. If I open the door, it's in competition with anybody who's trying to pull it closed. And that's like all of our actions, they're always zero sum. With God, at least in this Thomistic scheme, God's action is able to act 100% without limiting our agency. So when God wills me to talk on this live stream at the moment, I'm still making that free choice. God wills me to freely choose to speak on this live stream. It uses a kind of causal framework that is so alien to us today. It's difficult, I think, to get our head around, not least because of the mystery of God. But that's very much Tolkien's notion of Eru Iluvatar in The Lord of the Rings. And Gandalf is able to resist the power of the ring, in part because he trusts God's providence. He knows that there's something greater than himself, and it's directing things. So it's not all down to him. It's not down to him alone to defeat Sauron. If it's the will of Eru Iluvatar, it will be done. And ultimately it is done through the most unlikely of means, which is Gollum falling over the edge, which Tolkien, in one of his letters, says is the author taking over from Frodo, completing the quest, the author being God. So Gandalf doesn't fall into the trap that Saruman does, that he needs to take the ring to defeat Sauron because he knows that there's someone larger with more power, indeed a power beyond his own, who is directing things, and for good or for ill, it will be done. So he trusts Eru's plan, essentially. That's why he's willing to give his life on the bridge of Khazad-dûm. And that faith helps him resist. So it's that sense and trust in transcendent order which is really key for Gandalf. So it's humility, it's knowledge, and it's faith. And those three things go together. I guess a further point you could just add, I've kind of already iterated this, is questioning oneself and being willing to listen and not see oneself as having all the answers. When I was preparing this, I was really quite. I found that really challenging because, if you're somebody who makes live streams or produces YouTube videos, and then for my work, my job is to write articles and produce books and so on, researching topics. My job is to try and raise questions and then provide some interesting responses to that. And there's a temptation to think that you have the answers, or have an inflated sense of your own knowledge, and that, oh, everybody else needs to know this thing that I know. Gives you a sense of self-exaltation. And so it was quite challenging thinking about these things and thinking, actually, no, I'm not the wisest, and just being willing to accept, actually, maybe I need to have a smaller view of myself and not be so forthcoming and be slower to speak and quicker to listen. I certainly thought that. And so to do that, questioning my own motives and how far I actually know things, questioning my end goal with things. So if I think something's good, why am I actually thinking I need to do this? trying to row back on any savior complexes or senses of, oh, I need to be the one to change X, Y, or Z, and focusing more on what is my actual vocation? What have I been called to? What am I supposed to be doing with my life? And trying to examine things in that context. Restraint, constraining the self, I guess. If the constrained vision sees institutions as constraining human action and kind of the dangers of us getting power, then self-examination is a way of constraining our own motives and so on. It's a way of doing it ourselves. So yeah, so at the same time, that should, and I want to reiterate this, it's not a plea to just roll over then. Is it because knowing yourself, or knowing God and knowing yourself, which I guess is what I've been arguing Gandalf relies upon to resist the temptations of the ring. But Augustine says that's the key. And when you know God and know yourself, you're able to identify truth and thus resist evil, or at least call it out. And so it's not submitting to darkness, but it's remaining aware of your own perilous walk with darkness, a darkness that lies within every heart. So that is kind of the summary, I guess, of evil, or at least the dangers of the unconstrained vision and pride that are evident in Saruman, in Sam even, and some suggestions as to how we might be able to resist our own proclivity to follow the unconstrained vision with our own conceited senses of ourselves and with our perhaps faulty convictions as to what is good. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to look through the chat from the beginning, and feel free to put any questions or comments in the chat. Anything you agree with, disagree with, things you want to expand on, I'd love to hear. And just before I get into it, just say thank you, all of you who have tuned in, whether from the beginning, middle, end, wherever. I really appreciate your time and that you've been a very willing and good engaging audience, and I appreciate that. I really do. Let's see, Vingle, reading LOTR again now. Can't get enough of good old Tolkien. It really is just one of the... It's great. It's great. I'm so glad that you're reading it again, Vingle. And I'm tempted to start reading it again. You know that thing, though, where you're analysing something, so it doesn't quite say it have the same magic? I think I need a week away from it also after the stream, and then maybe I'll read it again. And maybe there is another stream or two in why it's so good, because that is an interesting thing in itself. Good evening to you, Byron Brand Stepwise. Great to see you. I'm seeing the bit where the sounds cut out briefly. Fortunately, it didn't last too long. Great to see you, Apostolic Majesty. And if any of you don't know Apostolic Majesty, he has a fantastic, absolutely wonderful channel where he does a lot of great streams on various historical periods, but they're not superficial overviews of history. They're actually, one of the things that's really great about AM's channel is he goes into great detail and shows you aspects of things that even if you're really knowledgeable about something, you'll see a new dimension of or a new connection. So I'd thoroughly recommend you check out his channel, especially the streams on Tolkien, but all of it, it's great. I think this is the Eliot quote you're referencing here, Loel. Let me find it again. O Lord, deliver me from the man of excellent intention, an impure heart. For the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Certainly sounds like a scriptural passage. Let me see. I'm going to just quickly put that into Google and see if it appears anywhere. But even if it doesn't, it's that sort of sense of the heart is deceitful and wicked, and we're often misled by our by by what we think is right, by our desires. We live in an age where we're taught to trust our desires and see them as our truest selves, that they are our authentic selves, and we need to express our desires fully in our bodies. And if we don't, we're being insincere. But actually, our thoughts and our desires, our emotions, which produce our behavior, are often for things which are not good. And we have to be careful about that. We have to question ourselves. I guess that's partly where something like Sauron or Saruman goes wrong. They don't question their hearts and desires. They just assume they're good, or at least they give in to them. I see this is where it all went wrong again, but it's come back. His arm grown on. Yes, indeed it has. Sauron's arm is growing long, in many ways. At first, I didn't understand this, but I see you put Shelob underneath. Yes, Shelob interfering with the interwork. Though this was like a Big Bang reference or something. Big Bang Theory reference. The heart has reasons that reason knows not of. Very, very true, Noel. Very true. And Pascal, he's a great thinker. Just amazing. I'm very tempted one day to do a stream on Pascal. I think he's so underappreciated. But on this point, I don't know. Yeah, I'll share it with you. There's a theory that emerged primarily from gender and queer studies called affect theory. I don't know how many of you know of it, but its general contention is that emotions, as typically understood in the literature, have a cognitive aspect to them. They're an appraisal of an object received through the senses. So this is quite a Stoic idea, which has been brought back by somebody like Martha Nussbaum. So if I see a bear in the woods, the idea of an emotion here is that when I observe it, I apprehend this bear. Now I know that a bear is dangerous. So this evokes, and I make this judgment that this is a potentially harmful object, and this evokes in me fear or trepidation, something like that. So the interpretation is key. Affect theory proposes that before you get to that interpretive judgment, there is what you might say an intensity in the body, which is at an unconscious level. It's a kind of a bodily feeling which is aroused by non-rational factors. So it could be, for example, that when somebody walks into the room, even before you've judged it in that split second, instinctually you feel something in response to them. Maybe it's about the way that they walk or the clothes that they wear. Maybe it's their hairdo. Maybe it's their smell. All these things which you don't consciously think about make an impression on you and affect you. Now, there are problems with this theory, and I think it probably goes too far in dividing affect and emotion and the cognitive element. But certainly, this theory, what it's good at is it emphasizes the role of the non-rational in impacting us and how often we're not aware of it. And these affects are key to our actions, but also how the rational struggles to control our affects. We can often think a certain thing for a long time. We may have certain beliefs sincerely held, but they won't move our emotions or our ethics, I should say. So somebody who's grieving, for example, they may believe they should move on. They may believe that their loved one has gone to a better place, but they can't shake that feeling of grief. That is what affect theory gets at. And it's something that psychologists and advertisers and politicians are all using to great effect. And we all instinctually use it to a certain degree. Nudge theory is probably a good example of this, and other non-rational communication that we all do, and it's probably built into our hierarchies and so on. So yeah, I think that is an interesting theory which tries to go some way to explaining something of the sense of what Pascal's getting at here. And there's so much to think about there, because then if we're impacted in these ways, primarily, if it's a physiological response before cognition, which ultimately directs our beliefs and our actions to some degree, then spiritual transformation, for example, cannot just consist in having the right beliefs or having doctrinally true beliefs, or even, as Thomas Chalmers suggested, having a more lovely object to follow, i.e., God. Conversion requires more than just having the right judgments. It's situationally based. It's how we're impacted by all things at a non-rational level too. And that raises a whole host of questions. Can you do that if you live the rest of your life? So a lot of people are finding a lot of Christian community online, especially during lockdown, with churches were being closed. But the question is, well, if you take people out of the church building and they're not worshipping together, if you use affect theory, you can see, well, you're losing the impact or the causes of these, for want of a better word, godly affects, or affects which are creating a kind of love for God. So then, if you remove that, what are you doing to people's spiritual health, etc., etc.? I know that that's a big tangent, but you've got me on a roll here with this. I think there's so many interesting aspects to that, and it raises questions, I think, for kind of online discussions in the circles we swim in, because so much of it is guided by kind of intellectual discussion and what we should believe. And indeed, this stream, in many ways, has been about what we should believe. Although hopefully you take away some other things too. But affect theory suggests actually we need to think less about what we believe and what we're interacting with at an unconscious level. That opens a can of worms, and I can't get into it now, but maybe on another stream. This, I imagine, is Saruman we're talking about here, and yeah, he would not stoop to conquer. Yes, he must be in charge. He must be God. Quite right too. I'm not sure if that's in response to the previous. I guess so. No worries, Iron Duke. Great to see you, and great to see you now, and hopefully you'll be able to catch up the rest later. England turned socialist after World War II, and I see below, in many respects, during World War II. I can definitely see that argument for then, with the creation of the National Health Service and the welfare state and so on. It certainly was no longer a free market economy. I guess nowadays, though, one of the things that I've been thinking about is all the old categories seem to be broken by what we live in now. Everything has to be caveated. So it's not capitalism, it's global, managerial, multinational corporation capitalism. Socialism, communism, capitalism, they're too simplistic. They're, for the 21st century, well, that's the wrong way of putting it. The 20th century political visions. And we live in an age where they don't apply anymore. So I find it hard to even describe what we live in now from where we were. But yes, I think the role of the state became much greater in World War II, and certainly in Britain. Now, I was thinking about this the other day. You can't do anything without really the impact of the state in one way or another in Britain. And for somebody like Max Stackhouse, who I spoke a bit about last time on the channel in that on the live stream to do with Protestantism and the origins of woke uh, politics, Stackhouse suggests that actually that's a totally wrong way of conceiving of society. That we lots of people think on all sides of the political and religious spectrum that really society has government at the top and everything flows from there. And so the aim should be to have the right people in power and persuading them to do what we want them to do, to enact the right policies. However, Stackhouse points out that actually there are a number of different spheres to society. So there is the family, and that sphere is primarily to do with sexual ethics and kind of kinship bonds and things like that. It regulates our sexuality and gives it a context to flourish. You then have the political, which deals with power, authority, the law, and creates a system of order within society. You have the economic, which deals with trade and provides the opportunity for fulfilling our needs, but also for creating abundance. And you have the cultural, which deals with communication, but also art, music, and so on, the pursuit of beauty. Now, each of these spheres, and there's probably more, should not be dominated by any one. In fact, they work best when they are working together but have their own independence in certain ways. They have their own room to breathe. If anyone dominates, it's very much like Sauron or Saruman. If any creature dominates, I guess, the whole system, it becomes perverted from its natural course. This is what Tolkien called the state god. So I think we're totally out of whack if you find that logic plausible. We're totally out of whack with what society ought to be and how it should be structured. And indeed, our very frame of reference for trying to change it is totally out of whack because we think we need the ring of power, we need the government to implement these changes. Whereas somebody like Stackhouse says, actually, we need a big opening up. We need to destroy the ring and open up these spheres. It's an interesting idea. I'm not totally sure, but I think there's some truth to it somewhere. Gollum the Great, eat fish 3 times a day, wriggling and raw. You keep your nasty chips. Corporate globalism. Yes, this is certainly a kind of vision of the anointed with its unconstrained philosophy. And you could certainly see somebody like Saruman being in a multinational corporation today, or the World Economic Forum with the Great Reset. Perhaps that's an analogy you could make. That I don't doubt for a second these people believe they're doing sincere good for the world, and but at the same time they want power with it. They have to be the ones that enact it, and they often talk with their kind of expert knowledge. I think there's definitely a connection you can make there about what they want to achieve and the role of and the comparison with somebody like Saruman. But I think it's a really important point, and I think this is what one of the things I've been trying to get across is that we face the same temptations, and ultimately they want, at least in part, they want to do what's good, so we can have empathy on that point or sympathy on that point, and that's a point of connection and engagement then, rather than seeing them as absolutely evil. Rather, actually, we can discuss what is the good. And can we guard ourselves from the same temptations? I would very much urge that sort of attitude to them. And that's certainly what I would urge with Tony Blair. I know where you're getting this from, Lowell. Some people call him the Dark Lord. I'm always hesitant to name him on the same level as somebody like Satan, because that does an injustice to the danger and darkness that Satan wreaks in this world. But I think he's very much in the mold. And indeed, thinking about him probably had some level of influence on this, on me being inspired to do this stream. He's somebody who has a very clear conviction that what he's doing is right. We saw it with Iraq. He genuinely believed that he was doing the right thing by trying to bring liberal democracy to Iraq. But he also wants power, and he believes he's the one that has the wisdom to bring it into being, him and his group. And his persistence in politics, his need to be in advising governments with his various institutes, with his connections to various NGOs and multinationals, and still trying to shape the direction of Britain and the world more generally, speak to somebody who has a belief in their own right to be there, because he believes he is the one that has the wisdom to shape the world, and because he likes power. Or at least it seems that way. I don't know him personally. So I think you can see all these things in him, just as they are in many of us. But he is exceptional at this approach, right? He's one of the best at pushing his agenda for what he thinks is good for the benefit of all, and for remaining in the top echelons of power. Yeah, I think that's you can see a lot of it in him. What I've been describing today, and it's a caution to us rather than somebody to judge in that regard. The heart is deceitful is the start. Indeed, very much so, Noel. Surely what one deems evil at its very core is what one deems to be against what they value and treasure. Yes, I agree. And this is what we need to be careful about then. What do we treasure? Saruman treasured his own self-exaltation, so he believed anything which goes against that is evil. Whereas Gandalf sees God's plan as good, and honouring God is the greatest good, and so sees idolatry, or the pride of Saruman and Sauron, as evil. So I think, and Jesus talks about this, where your treasure is, there your heart is. So very much agree across the room. There also seems to be a constant pushing and pulling of the individual and the group, the dominant ultimately, to some degree, redefining evil at cultural and sometimes even genetic levels. Yes, I don't think there's a problem with seeing that either, but that's where the importance of a transcendent moral and metaphysical order is needed. And I don't know if you saw my last stream, but I spoke a bit about how for Stackhouse, every society, for society to flourish, you need to have a religious worldview amongst its people. In essence, because the commitment to a moral order which is independent of human conception, or at least in the belief in that, then provides a standard for judging and critiquing the ways in which the political sphere, the economic sphere, cultural sphere, and familial sphere are ordered within a society. You can do it by appealing to the Ten Commandments, for example. So if a society is promoting murder or adultery or whatever, you can say, Ten Commandments says this, and it's instituted by God, the highest authority. We need to change this. So that provides a basis for pushing against the redefining of evil if it's out of line with that. And that's something we've lost in our society. We see it all as human construction, or at least we're taught to see it that way. And that's where you end up with, at the end of the day, the evils of communism and fascism, and because they redefine what's evil. And liberal democracy too, the evils of a liberal democracy, I should say as well. I'm loving these comments. The heart chooses, then the reason is engaged. That's why we must always question our own righteousness. Here, Lowell. And I guess this is when I was talking about affect theory. It's a quite a Humean idea. David Hume, reason is slave to the passions. It's very much that sort of idea. And you're right, we must always question our own righteousness. And that is certainly one of the first steps to guarding against falling into this vision of the anointed approach. But it's very difficult to do. And often we can see ourselves as, well, implicitly as righteous by questioning our own righteousness. Oh, I'm okay. I question my own righteousness. I'm not accusing you of that. I guess I'm just. It's a risk even in that. As Martin Luther kind of claimed, everything we do is tinged with sin. So even these good things can fall into that. You can think your way to faith, but grace touches the heart. I guess this depends on what you mean by faith. If you just mean belief, then yes, I agree fully with that statement. It's you need to be changed by something other than yourself. Paul talks about having the mind of Christ, which to the people of the day it was foolishness. What Christian belief is, and indeed today, Christian belief is seen as foolish and stupid and even evil by many people. It takes supernatural agency to change somebody to have faith in the Lord Jesus Christ and that he's risen from the dead, which is quite amazing when you think about it. Let's see, got a few more comments here. The voice of Saruman reminds me of Blair. Well, Saruman had an ability to manipulate people using his voice, and certainly Tony Blair and various politicians have that ability. And he has this amazing ability to say things in such a way that they seem very reasonable. But when you push what he's actually saying, it can be a lot more radical than is initially kind of on the surface. I think, though, with Blair, I never get the impression that he wants to harm people directly, or at least he thinks he's doing what's best for them. And I think at points Saruman, when his pride is injured and he's slipped away from that vision of what he thinks is right, where he just wants vengeance, then there's no sense that he wants to benefit the hobbits or anything like that. Whereas I still feel with Blair, he genuinely believes what he's doing is the best for the world. And that he needs to be the one to, if he's not there, then things are going to be worse. And I think that helps us to understand him a bit better and how he works and why he's such a powerful force. He has a sense of his own righteousness. He's self-righteous in that regard. He's on a moral quest. The World Council of Religions is coming, no doubt. We're close. Yeah, it's an interesting idea, and I think it's going to be interesting. I mean, we live in all ages are unprecedented, but with globalization, which is not just kind of these top level things, but things like the internet with communication, even this live stream wouldn't be possible without globalization some way or another. There's all these changing things that are happening in the world. And religion, particularly the Abrahamic religions with the universal application, are, well, Stackhouse suggests that they have a way, they may be they have the universal but diverse, they have a diverseness within themselves, but a universal extent, being monotheistic. And so they may be able to provide a value system for something like globalization, provide a unifying point that other the lack of religion is unable to do. So if there was an attempt to create a one world society, which is actually what Stackhouse wants, and that's an interesting idea, a one world civilization, one of those universal religions would be a good starting point. In his view, it's Christianity, but he's also says, well, maybe it could be Islam or something like that. It's an interesting idea. Interesting. I did not know that, but yeah. So perhaps, but I don't. I've not. I've not seen enough of a push in the short term to see that as being a reality. I think it would. It seems that there's other forces or other agendas that are going to be pushed first before you get to something like a universal religion. And it may not be one of those. It could be an attempt to create a civic religion, like you found in the French Revolution with the cult of reason, or it could be something else entirely. But certainly that loss of religion has led to fragmentation. So we'll see. Noel's suggesting the Pope and the UN are one. I think the problem with this, well, I don't know. I'm not going to speak on something I don't know enough about. I shall think about it more. That's the end of the comments for now. But just I'll give a few minutes in case anybody else has any other comments they wish to put in or anything else they would like to add. Please feel free, and even after the stream, feel free to put your comments down and any interesting questions or thoughts or points of view or points you disagreed with or tips for perhaps avoiding the evil we've been talking about. In the meantime, just say a bit more about plans for the future. So next week, the next few months are going to be pretty busy for me. I'm currently writing a new course that undergraduates will take next year on emotion, spirituality, and mysticism in early modern Christianity. So I'll just have to see where I get with that first before I can commit to doing a live stream every week. So it might move to every couple of weeks or month or so, or maybe I might try and do some videos, shorter videos. It takes a bit of time to prepare for these. So we'll just have to see. But given some of the comments that we've had today and how I kind of went off on one on affect theory, might have something to do with that and how it relates to spiritual transformation, the non-rational. I think that would be an interesting stream to do, something like that. Beyond that, and on a connected note, I spoke about maybe looking at the role of ritual and community membership in spiritual transformation. I guess those tie in, so maybe that would tie into the stream. And yeah, I think that's most of what might be coming up. Yeah. Oh, and another thing I would appreciate just before your go. So usually I stream at 3 p.m. Obviously today I've streamed at 7 p.m. If you would prefer me to stream at 7, put 1 in the chat. If you prefer me to stream at 3, put 2 in the chat. I'd very much appreciate the poll. I appreciate I'm also like polling people watching at 7, so maybe it's not the best way of doing it. But if you could do that, I would much appreciate it. I'll give you a second to get that in. Yeah, and the only other thing I guess to mention is obviously I don't know if any of you saw, but during the football earlier today, I was watching the Denmark-Finland game. Christian Eriksen collapsed. Top footballer, but he just collapsed on the pitch, and it looked like he might die. But fortunately, he survived, and he's doing well. And praise be to God for that. So that is good. Noel says it's 6:12 a.m. here. So, well, I guess I don't know if this is better than 3 p.m. British time. This because I guess that would be what, like 12 o'clock at night. Would that be better? I don't know. What would you prefer? Oh, and other future things while I'm waiting is that I think in the future I might do some streams, get some guests on to talk about music and spirituality, particularly from the Christian tradition. And yeah, we'll see. We'll see if it is how music is used in worship, how it can be used to elevate our souls, but also used to in our private spirituality. I have plans to do that over the next year or so. We'll see if we get around to it. I know it's a bit of a departure in some ways, but I think it would be a good thing to do. Midnight. I mean, in the sense, Noel, that if it's currently 6:12 a.m. here, and I did a stream at 3 p.m., that would be 6 hours in the past. So that would be for you midnight. So I don't know. And Brandon 22 is, so I guess that means 3 o'clock. I'm guessing. I don't think this polls work very well. Put your comments in the chat or in after the stream. Comment. What do you want? Do you prefer 3, 7, or maybe another time? Or maybe I'll make a poll. That might be easier. I've been speaking for a while, and it's been great fun. I've really appreciated you all tuning in. And yes, 3 p.m. I see. Okay, we're getting different. We're getting different positions here. I'll just. I'll think about it. I'll pray about it. In the meantime, I hope you all have a fantastic rest of the day wherever you are, and that whatever challenges you face in the next week, that God's grace would be with you, and that you would be ambassadors of His goodwill. And then I pray that all of you would be given humble hearts and see the wickedness in yourselves and be able to bring a light to others as a result. Till we next meet, God's grace and peace be with you.